Recently, I met up with a friend who's also a priest. But as soon as I walked into the cafe, I could tell that something was up. There was none of the usual cheery insults. Other folk joined us, but they couldn't stay, so it was only after they had left that my friend rather awkwardly began, "So Lizzie, I had a moment yesterday." And so I heard the heartbreaking news of a little girl we both knew who had lost her daddy to cancer, and how that very next day, Grandma had simply dropped her back at school, which was where my friend saw her. That encounter, they said, was just haunting me. They said, "I have never felt so useless in all my ministry." I invited my friend to share what happened, and I'll share with you what happened later. But first, I'd like us to wander into today's gospel reading together and look at the story of Jesus' sermon on the plain. It's worth noticing when this story falls in Luke. The previous chapter recounts Jesus starting to heal and to teach in ways that were countercultural and controversial. We hear how his actions quickly attract negative attention from the religious authorities of the day, the scribes and the Pharisees, as Jesus challenges laws and conventions and mixes with the wrong sort, tax collectors and sinners. I love how tax collectors have a distinct category of disgracefulness all of their own. We hear Jesus claiming his authority to forgive sin. We hear him asking difficult questions, disrupting the concept of what is intended by a holy day of rest. Jesus heals and eats and rebukes and forgives in ways that challenge the status quo. He begins to stir things up, which never makes anybody popular. He proves to be a controversial, curious figure, but so far he's acting alone. Until right before today's reading, there's an account of Jesus selecting his disciples, prayerfully discerning, alone on a mountain, who, from the many who are beginning to listen, get it, and get it enough to commit to joining him. It's no simple task, given the interest and controversy now surrounding him. It's fair to say that the folk chosen by Jesus are not in for an easy ride, and they will know this. So the context for today's reading, exciting but controversial actions of Jesus, an appointment of 12 people to leave familiar lives and join in with something radically new and potentially dangerous, is important to remember when we look at the events described this morning. Events that begin with Jesus coming down from that mountain to stand on a level plain. A level plain where he's immediately swamped by a diverse crowd of desperate people needing and demanding his attention. However, in the midst of all that chaos and suffering that he's waded into, Jesus looks up to his disciples, men who will be rapidly realizing this is where the rubber hits the road. What on earth have we signed up to? In the midst of all that chaos, Jesus looks up at these nervous men and addresses them, proclaiming, "Blessed are the poor, the hungry, the weeping." I wonder how the disciples interpreted this. Did they feel blessed as they watched the crowd come to take what it could from this new celebrity rabbi? Did they see the crowd as blessed? Did they see hope amongst the poverty, hunger, and sadness? Or did they only see how shame, need, and pain cause intense suffering and wonder, well, what are the blessings in such a life? Did they wonder whether that was how they were meant to live, to receive blessing? Did they wonder what they were called to do for this crowd, for their leader? Did they have those questions running through their heads? Because I certainly do. I look at the way the political landscape is changing. I look at the polarization between rich and poor, and I cannot say I see blessing for those who are at the mercy of the powerful right now. I am not sure I could look at somebody from Gaza or Sudan in the eye and say, you are blessed right now. I'm not sure I could look someone who had been a victim of abuse in a church in the eye and say, you are blessed right now, particularly when I am not offering much to them in the way of blessing. How are we to understand blessings? I wonder. Maybe there is something to be said about noticing the goodness around us. Maybe there is something to learn about appreciation, about recognizing what a blessing might actually look and feel like at a particular time. I'll give you a rather simple example. After a long, difficult labour, I was finally given the promised round of toast when my daughter's birth. And I remember how good that toast tasted because I was ravenous and how grateful I felt for it. When I compare that toast to the fancy cheese board and rich leftovers I grazed late on Christmas night, well, the toast was definitely a blessing. And the buffet, yeah, it's delicious, but I neither needed it nor felt nourished by it. I was already full. Or more seriously, when I remember meeting friends when life's been tough, those conversations at that time and those shared tears and laughter feel sharper and sweeter than ever they do when all is well with the world. Blessings are cherished for their honest and they're significant, and they offer safety and welcome respite. Blessings apparently come in disguise. Maybe we only see them when we are in some way impoverished or hungry or sad. The times I feel blessed are not times when life is comfortable. They are times of weakness and vulnerability, when a need, a hunger, a poverty of sorts, if you like, is fully met. Or maybe we are blessed simply in the act of recognizing and receiving a blessing, making us twice blessed as we notice and we cherish something which in turn brings us joy, comforts us, fulfills us, and ultimately offers us a glimpse of the goodness of the kingdom of God surrounding us all the time, if only we were to notice it and to be grateful for it. Or maybe the blessed somehow stand out to God, are those closest to God's heart, at the forefront of God's mind, God's priority. The poor, the hungry, and the weeping stand out for God. Where was Jesus when he preached about who is blessed? Right in the center of a crowd who were in need, desperate, downcast, on their level, but looking up and calling out to the 12 he had chosen, whilst they, in turn, are trying to spot their rabbi, now so blended with the swirling crowds, so immersed in the mess of humanity, that it becomes almost impossible to distinguish between who is blessing and who is blessed. It's not simply a reminder from Jesus that these are the people who matter, that these are the people you are to get involved with. It's also as though Jesus is saying, you need to look closely at that crowd, for I am in and with those people. And when you come to look for me there, you'll find you're part of that crowd too. There will be mess and stress in and amongst the chaos, but stick with it. Look out for me. Bring hope, food, laughter, joy, and comfort. Yes, the blessed and the blessing will cost you. But how much more rewarding to build my kingdom than to ignore its existence and manage your own? When you follow me into this crowd, it won't be very long before you too cannot easily distinguish between who is blessing and who is blessed. Our world still has crowds of needy people, and sometimes those crowds of needy people include you and me. But when we remember Jesus speaks from the midst of the crowd, we have both the reassurance that he is wholeheartedly empathizing with us, and also the challenge, as his followers today, to us, to be blessed, to be a blessing, to come down from where we might be hesitantly perched on that mountainside and to be little Christs, which is what Christian means. To be on a level with Jesus, with the crowds, with one another. But before we panic about the size of the crowd and the scale of the calling, it's also worth remembering that even and especially Jesus healed, restored, and affirmed the crowd one person at a time, doing what he could, blessing each with what they needed most in that moment, blessing each with what they needed most at that moment. I promised I'd return to my friend's encounter with that little girl, for the story needs telling. But it needs telling with my friend's words entwined within God's living word. For all our small stories are interwoven into God's glorious story. So you might like to close your eyes as you listen for a minute, and Sue and I will tell that story. I was in the school dinner hall, and it was heaving because all the year 2s were eating, and the year 3s and year 4s were joining the queue.
A great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people.
I've not been in school for a bit, so all the kids are milling round and wanting to chat with me.
All in the crowd were trying to touch him.
When I just caught sight of her, just standing there in the middle of the gap between the queue and the tables, and she looked utterly lost. Her face it still haunts me.
Those who were troubled.
And it was the usual dinner chaos, so no one spotted her.
A great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon.
So I went over. She's so tiny, I kind of had to kneel down beside her in the middle of the canteen.
He came down to meet them on a level place.
And before I could say anything, she puts her arms out for a hug, and I'm sort of stuck, really.
Trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed all of them.
And I couldn't think of anything to say to her.
Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh.
I've never felt so useless in all my ministry. I can't get her face out of my head.
Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh.
My friend couldn't do what that little girl wanted most. She wanted her daddy back. None of us could do that. All of us are poor and hungry and weeping at times. As we talked, I told my friend that when I was young and bewildered by grief and surrounded by people who didn't want to notice me because nobody believed they'd have anything useful to say, just one person offered me a hug and simply allowed me to cry, meeting me on my level, being a little Christ. He was my local minister, and he just got it. And I have never forgotten that. His getting it meant that years later, James and I married in his church in Scotland, despite it being a massive hassle because we lived in Pudsey at the time. That minister doesn't know that. He probably went away from a grieving young person feeling useless too. So I remind us again, as we stand on that mountainside, before we panic about the size of the crowd or the scale of the calling, it is also worth remembering that even and especially Jesus healed, restored, and affirmed one person at a time, doing what he could, blessing each with what they needed most in that moment. Your blessing might simply be a hug. Amen.